Hey class, this is Module 42 covering mood disorders, in particular major depressive disorder and bipolar disorders. So you noticed probably from the last module that all the disorders that were covered, the central theme had to do with anxiety. So they're all classified as anxiety disorders, and those disorders that have a primary feature involving abnormal mood states would be considered or classified as mood disorders. Everyone has mood swings. Our moods tend to fluctuate over time. People with bipolar disorder have extreme mood swings. If you notice the little chart there, the 0 would be like a typical or average mood state. And you can see that people with bipolar disorder have swings from depression to what we call manic phases or mania. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Whereas people with major depressive disorder have spend a lot of time with their mood states in the depressed area. So major depressive disorder it's one of the most common psychological disorders. And I mean, aside from lower back pain, it's number 2. Considering lower back pain, it's the number 2 cause of disability in the United States. So, and worldwide, this is of course like a lot of disorders you see in almost every culture. So, there are lots of different symptoms associated with that, and I'm just going to kind of focus here on the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. To be diagnosed with this disorder, and this is the diagnostic criteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. During a period of 2 weeks, you have to have 5 or more of the following symptoms and represent a change in functioning. So we talked about thoughts, feelings, or behaviors causing a person distress or causing distress to others. The other criteria was that they're dysfunctional. That means it interferes with their ability to function or carry out normal activities or daily functions. And so with all disorders, there's some degree of dysfunction generally associated with them. And so with depression, probably the most common thing is the mood state. It's a sense of sadness or despair. But people can't have a hard time maybe finding joy in anything, even activities that they used to enjoy maybe don't bring them any pleasure. But a big one that gets overlooked a lot is the effect it has on people physically. It can lead to a lot of fatigue and even general achiness in parts of the body. So there's a loss of energy, and that's why some people who are depressed would say they can't even get out of bed some days. And part of it is the sense of despair, but a lot of it is also just the physical exhaustion that can go along with that disorder as well. So I'm not going to cover all of those, but you could pause the video if you wanted to look over those a little bit. And I'm going to try to keep these a little bit short and to the point. One of the things with depression is that sometimes people get in negative thinking styles, kind of a habit of thinking negatively. And so, something bad happens, like maybe they do poorly on a couple exams, and then they have a negative explanatory style, maybe thinking that they're dumb, that they're not capable of doing well in college, which causes them to be depressed. What happens when you're depressed, though, is that it also affects your cognitive and behavioral changes. So if you're depressed, you're more likely to think about things negatively and think about more negative things in general, and that just creates more stress, and so it can become a really vicious cycle. So in terms of cognitive therapy, one approach, if we're using cognitive therapy, might be to help change the way they think about things, change the way they attribute outcomes in their life. And rather than being really pessimistic, try to help them to look at things a little more optimistically and things of that nature. So So this would be an example of a negative attribution style versus a positive attribution style. If someone were to experience a breakup with a partner, you can cope with that successfully if you think of it as something that's temporary, something that's only specific to that aspect of your life, rather than saying like everything about your life is horrible, and just say, well, I'm just struggling right now with my relationship. And if you consider it as an external factor, that it's not just your fault. There's some things about the other person that you have no control over that could contribute to that breakup. And that allows you to cope more successfully because it seems temporary. It's very specific to one thing in your life, and it wasn't all your fault. On the other hand, if you look at this from a very pessimistic view, you feel that this is something that you're never going to get over with, so it's stable. Not having a partner is going to fix everything in your life, so it's global, and it was all your fault. And that's a very pessimistic and negative way to view that. And so, again, in therapy, sometimes in addition to medication, or sometimes even without medication, if we're just doing psychotherapy or talk therapy, if a psychologist notices a person has a tendency to think about things in this negative kind of way, one approach to therapy would to help them recognize their negative thinking patterns and challenge them to think more logically and rationally about things. And honestly, is from personal experience, years ago, I went to a psychologist because I have mild depression, and at the time I was having some anxiety problems too. And the cognitive therapy really helped me to catch myself. I getting these negative thinking traps where kind of like blaming myself for everything bad that would happen at home, or if I had a handful of students who didn't do well on a test, I would blame myself for that. I wasn't a good teacher, and it was really kind of I can look back at that now and see that my thinking was kind of illogical. It didn't, because there's always going to be some students who don't do well on a test, maybe because they don't even study. So my psychologist helped challenge me to notice when I was feeling bad about something or myself, and then to challenge the thoughts I was having that were causing that feeling. And that was really helpful to me at that time. So now bipolar disorder, as I mentioned a little bit ago, this is where people have mood states that fluctuate from depression to mania, and what we might call their manic phase. And when people are in their manic phase, they tend to have a lot of thoughts racing through their heads. They might speak really fast. They can be really positive and optimistic about things, and almost like they're have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Some of those characteristics when they're in their manic phase. And some people are very creative when they're in their manic phase. There are a lot of famous artists and such who suffered from bipolar disorder and did some of their most creative work when they were in their manic phase. The downside, though, to the manic phase, though, is that sometimes people can be easily distracted. They can be very impulsive. So sometimes they can make poor decisions. Sometimes people drink a lot, spend a ton of money when they're in their manic phase, can get themselves in debt in that way, or just general impulsivity, making poor decisions quickly without thinking about consequences. Sometimes there is, along with the inflated self-esteem, there's what we call the delusion of grandeur or grandiosity, which is sometimes their belief like that they're so smart and smarter than most everyone else, and sometimes they might feel like they have special abilities when they're in their manic phase, and that can lead to all kinds of problems. So yes, maybe a little bit more creative during the manic phase, a lot of energy. Sometimes they don't sleep much when they're in their manic phase, but that's not always a good thing. There's a lot of downside to that type of behavior pattern. So I'm going to show you a video about a guy named Craig, and he's being interviewed. He's being interviewed, and he's in his manic phase. I think he seems a little bit fidgety, but nothing too overboard. I mean, if you look at him really objectively, he's probably not that fidgety, but if you think of him as in his manic phase, you might interpret it a little more as fidgety behavior. But the big thing and the main reason I want to show you is his flight of thoughts. So because he's got thoughts racing through his head, it's hard for him to stay focused on answering the questions that are being asked of him. And so you really have to pay attention to what the question is and really pay attention to his answer. And if you do that, if you're listening casually, you might not catch it. But if you really pay attention to what's being asked of him, you'll notice he gets off track very easily and very frequently.
Jay at times has difficulty keeping Craig focused in this interview. Craig shows a flight of ideas with abrupt changes from topic to topic. Also, he talks about the depressed periods of his bipolar cycle, for he has attempted suicide 14 times.
How many times did I try to get rid of my life or felt down and out? Would say 14 times. So, until 77, when I had a bad awakening of what was going on, of all these drugs and everything.
Okay. You tried to kill yourself?
Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, growing up in my lifetime, my childhood, my dad says it takes two people to make an argument. If one person gets an argument with one brother, and that same person gets an argument with the other brother and the sister, then something is wrong. You have to eliminate that problem. In other words, brainwash myself to suicide.
Okay. Well, have you been depressed? Had periods where you were really down?
Yeah, I have, and I find out if I can work with somebody for the first 20 minutes, I don't have any problems.
How long will those depressions last when you get into them?
If I didn't talk to somebody, no more than 20 minutes.
And you'd get suicidal in 20 minutes?
No, in 20 minutes, I am already cured.
But if you had the depressions...
that I had before, before I really learned and understood that,
right.
See, I had to have some self-worth, and where my self-worth comes from is to literally put my life on the line for others.
I want to talk, if you can, about periods where you were feeling depressed and
suicidal and so forth. Because, well, I can tell you the reason what was behind that, and then I could tell you basically 14 times I ended up in the hospital.
Because you were depressed?
Because I was depressed.
Suicidal?
I was not always suicidal, but depressed, because I felt
how long would those
no one
depressions
loved
last?
me. Huh?
How long would those depressions last?
They would last. They were kind of stupid, because if I took an overdose on my own medication, that's all how I did it. There was one time I had my wrist slit. And I said, had my wrist slit because I cannot harm myself. That was terrible. I couldn't even slice my own wrist. I wasn't counting jail on somebody else.
14 times you've been pretty depressed, down in the dumps.
So as you can see from that clip, Craig does have a hard time staying focused and answering the questions, and he goes off on some little tangents now and then. There are also in the video where he talks about how he lays his life on the line for other people, would be a sign of his delusion of grandeur, or the sense of grandiosity that he has about himself being special or unique in some way. So anyway, that kind of wraps up the bipolar disorder. As we mentioned earlier, the bipolar disorder involves those varying phases of mood states from high to lows, and sometimes they hit areas in between as well, where depression is mostly the lower end of that. You don't necessarily have to know this for the exam, but I think it's always important to point out, because all semester long we've been bringing up the interaction between nature and nurture, and that's again, that's kind of how we view a lot of psychological disorders, is probably the unique interaction of influences. So bipolar disorder does tend to run in families, which suggests that there is probably a genetic link to that disorder somehow, whether it's a gene or a set of genes, or maybe just genes that make some people more vulnerable to those kinds of things. It's hard to say exactly, but that's true of most disorders. There's probably some kind of unique interaction there, and in particular, like with depression, talked about the negative explanatory style and how that influences people's moods, and then how your moods influence maybe that could impact what kind of places you go and what kind of things you do, and you get feedback from other people based on your behavior, and that might just perpetuate the depression, and all kinds of unique things going on there. So it's hard to filter out exactly what's going on. Of course, one of the major concerns with depression is not only that people suffer, but also it's one of the disorders that has the highest rate of suicide, and that is one of the major risk factors for suicide is suffering with depression. And interestingly, it's believed more and more that people are more likely to attempt suicide when they're coming out of a depression phase, because when people are majorly depressed, even though they're really miserable, they might not be motivated enough to take their own lives. So it's kind of like when the depression starts lifting a little bit, and they almost seem like they have a little more motivation than to follow through with suicide. But most people, it's hard to understand suicide. Sometimes family members and friends are mad. They think it's a selfish act on that person. But this is one of those things that if you've never been suicidal, you can't really judge somebody. I mean, you don't really know what it's like unless you've walked a mile in somebody's shoes, so to speak, right? So, I mentioned I deal with mild depression, and sometimes it gets a little worse, and sometimes it gets better. It kind of ebbs and flows a little bit. I've never been suicidal, but I know when my depression gets a little bit worse, it's a pretty miserable feeling, and I feel miserable at those times. I get really irritated easily, and I get angry easily and stuff like that. But it's just miserable. You don't find any much joy in anything. And what's frustrating is that you can't think of a good reason for being depressed. So particularly if it is rooted partly in a chemical imbalance, there's not a whole lot you might be able to do about that aside from taking medications and such. So but I've experienced the misery of mild depression, and so I don't know, maybe my perspective is a little different. I could see excuse me I could see where somebody could be miserable enough that the only way to escape that misery in their mind would be to commit suicide, and it's really unfortunate. But like I said, I've never been suicidal, but I can kind of understand how people could get to that point, and it's a miserable experience. So we want to be empathetic with people who have disorders of any kind. It's kind of oftentimes the opposite. The treatment they get is kind of the opposite of what people get when they have a medical issue. Like when somebody says they have cancer, a lot of people support them, and their family rallies around them, and their friends rally around them. And when somebody says they have bipolar disorder or something, a lot of people just basically run away, and you don't hear from them again. So, but people need social support all the time, no matter what the condition is. Anytime people are dealing with struggles, social support is an important component of that. So along with suicide, as some information in the book about that, and so it talks about some of the trends with suicide, and I'm going to show you a couple graphs related to those. So national trends, among most major nations, the United States is somewhere kind of in the middle there. There are some countries that almost always have much lower rates. So like Greece and Turkey and Italy and Spain, Britain, I think always has a pretty low rate. And there are some countries that historically have kind of high rates. So Japan, Korea, Belgium, Slovenia, and you can kind of see that trend there. Most of the time, suicide rates are presented as a numerical value. So United States is about 12.5. It's 12.5 people out of every 100,000 in the population will commit suicide. So suicides by race and ethnicity, generally speaking, white, non-Hispanic people generally have the highest suicide rate, followed closely by American Indian or Alaskan Natives. American Indian and Alaska Natives also have really high rates of alcoholism, substance abuse disorders, and there could be something related to that. By gender, men definitely outnumber women in suicides completed, but women do outnumber men in suicides attempted. So the reason that more men actually commit suicide is because they tend to use means that are more lethal. Like it's more likely for a man to shoot himself in the head. Women are more likely to do something that's not quite as lethal, like swallowing pills, an excessive number of pills, things like that. So, but yes, this has been a common trend for, and women have higher rates of depression. That may explain why they attempt suicide more. But men are definitely more likely to succeed in those attempts. Suicide rates by age. A lot of people think adolescents have the highest suicide rate, but that's not true. In fact, for many years, it was the elderly, 85 and older, probably because a lot of them had lost a loved one or had terminal illnesses or just felt like they were a burden to their families when they were maybe losing their capabilities and such. But in more recent years, middle-aged men, age 45 to 64 in that age grade, they actually have the highest suicide rate. If you look at the numbers there, you can see that teenagers actually have a relatively low rate compared to adults. The last topic is self-injury or non-suicidal self-injury. It's becoming more common for people to be familiar with cutters, as they might call them, or people who burn themselves maybe with cigarettes and lighters and such. People who hurt themselves or jab themselves with objects. And this is called non-suicidal self-injury because the vast majority of these people are not trying to kill themselves when they're just cutting themselves and or burning themselves. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's always related to, the emotional pain that they're feeling or almost a sense of numbness sometimes, emotional numbness. And so there are some bulleted items on the screen there that list some reasons for that. Females tend to injure themselves more than men. And you can see that those rates peak for girls during their teen years. And for men, it kind of hits its peak in the early 20s and then declines thereafter for both men and women. So we generally say that they're not attempting suicide, but sometimes it's an attempt to distract themselves from emotional pain by feeling physical pain, or sometimes they may feel a great deal of shame or guilt for their punishment or for their behavior in some way. Some people are really hard on themselves and they'll hurt themselves as almost a way to punish themselves. But anyway, you can review those items on the list there. That pretty much wraps up the coverage of this topic. And the next one we'll be moving on is to schizophrenia and other disorders. And I encourage you to watch that lecture video because there's a lot of symptoms associated with schizophrenia. And I have some video clips for you to show you that demonstrate some of those symptoms. So thank you for watching.